challenges to your convictions, and sometimes addressing the challenge head on is appropriate. You give the best answer, but I've noticed that sometimes you give the best answer you're capable of, and a lot of these things we could just knock these softballs out of the park. I'm noticing another trend though in some of these challenges that it amounts to a commission of a certain fallacy in thinking that a lot of these questions fall into the category of. For example, last weekend we had Rethink, the Student Apologetics Conference, and it was a fabulous success. 1,053 students and conferees registered, largely the vast majority of them high school students, and it was fabulous. But after each speaker, there were questions that were given to the speaker, and one of the speakers, Tim Barnett from Toronto, was speaking on the issue of astronomy and the fine-tuned constants of the universe and the solar system and the radical improbabilities of these things happening by accident. And to say that they're radical improbabilities it doesn't even do justice to the word improbability. And we're talking about finding one atom in the entire universe. That is, if all of the atoms in the universe were painted blue and one was red, you'd have to blindfolded pick the one atom by chance. That's the chance, for example, of some of these improbabilities. So it's radical. But a question that came up was, why is if God has created everything, why is there so much wasted space? And then Tim went on to explain that the space isn't wasted. It's actually, this amount of space is one of the fine-tuned constants. That the universe needs to be as large as it is in order for life to be possible here on our planet. And if you're in astronomy, you understand how that works. I don't have the details. But when I heard the question, it suddenly occurred to me what the problem is in an informal fallacy kind of way with the question itself. It's what's called complex question. It's the fallacy of complex question. Now, you may not have heard this fallacy before, but I know that you've heard of the classic example of complex question, and that is the question, are you still beating your wife? Now, we chuckle because we realize that there's a shell game going on with the question, because to answer the question, are you still beating your wife, is to answer implicitly another question, and that is, I used to beat my wife. And it's an unfair question because first you have to establish the first thing before the second thing is worth a legitimate question. You have to first establish that you used to beat your wife before you can ask the question, are you still doing that thing that you used to do? So this is the fallacy of the complex question. And this is the very fallacy that's in place when the person asks the question, why is there so much wasted space? Because what is the thing that is presumed by the question? That there is wasted space. So why is there so much wasted space presumes that there is wasted space, and when you ask the question that way, then it makes God look bad. But that presumes that there's wasted space. So my question would be to them, before I answer, why is there so much wasted space? I'd say, why are you presuming that it's wasted? And push it back on them. The right way to answer a complex question is to challenge the implied portion of the statement, the thing that's implied. If space is wasted, then why is there so much if God is so smart? Something like that. This also comes up in another challenge, very common to intelligent design. In fact, it's one that not only does Richard Dawkins make in his book, The God Delusion, but is one that was voiced to me when I debated Michael Shermer some 4 years ago on the question of the existence of God. And it was a radio debate, which still may be available in transcript form, I'm not sure. But they both raised the question, who designed the designer who created God? Okay? And Richard Dawkins says in his book, even a child knows to ask the question, who created God? Now, his rhetorical point is basically, this is such a significant problem for theists that even a child can see this difficulty, who created God? And if a child knows to ask this question, why would any adult not miss this kind of thing? Now, Michael Shermer, the same thing. Who created God? And he's offered this with a shrug, like this is such an impossible question for us to answer. But of course, it is impossible taken at face value, because in answering who designed the designer and who created God, if we answer it directly, or let me back up and put it this way, the question itself presumes the answer to another question that isn't explicit, it's implicit, or another issue, and that is that God was designed or that God was created. So when you say who created God, you're assuming God was created. Who designed God, you're assuming God was designed. And when did anybody claim such a thing on our side of the table? Never. Complex question. Are you still beating your wife? Exactly the same construction there. Now, I'll tell you the way that I responded when I was talking to, when I did my debate with Michael Shermer. I knew it was coming, and so I tried to put together a cogent or compelling or a pithy kind of response. When he said, who created God? I said, well, Michael, you don't believe that God was created because you don't believe in God. I don't believe that God was created because I think God was eternal. Nobody in our discussion believes God was created, so why are you asking the question, who created him? Now, that was a way of getting around, or like I said, a pithy way of trying to address this illicit challenge. And with regards to Richard Dawkins, yes, even children know to answer this question. But it isn't because of their profound knowledge. It's their lack of knowledge that they know to ask this question, rather. It's because they're kids. That's why they ask it. They don't conceive of an uncreated creator. And so it's natural for them to ask in their ignorance. But Richard Dawkins has got a PhD. He ought not be asking the kind of questions that children ask in their ignorance. In both cases, we have complex question. Why is there so much wasted space? Who designed the designer? Who created God? How about this? Same construal, but on a moral issue. Well, if homosexuality, how can homosexuality be bad if God created me this way? So God creates me gay, and now he's going to condemn me for it? What's the presumption there? Are you still beating your wife? Right. It's the same kind of presumption. The presumption is that God created the person gay, and if he did, then why would he be condemning him? But see, that's the point that hasn't been established yet. Again, complex question. So I just want you to keep your eyes open for when some kind of form of the challenge, are you still beating your wife, shows up, but in conversation that deals with these kind of ultimate issues, whether they're moral or whether they have to do with the existence of God, because they do come up a lot. And you might be able to ferret it out by quickly asking yourself the question, are they presuming something in their question that they have not yet established? And if they're presuming something that hasn't been established, then this is an example of a complex question. And you want to go to the presumption first before you take any responsibility to try to deal with the issue directly yourself.